What's going on, guys? So today I'm going to be talking you through the dosing frequency of anabolic and androgenic steroids, specifically looking at exogenous testosterone for the purposes of this video. Now, when we look at pinning frequency, all we are kind of debating up between is microdosing on a daily or a more frequent schedule, and maybe boom dosing or macro dosing on a much larger, less frequent scale. So, if you used to take HRT patients, for example, those are the people using exogenous testosterone, they will be given a certain compound that will have a specific ester attached to that compound, right? And all this refers to the ester is the duration or the half-life that it takes for said compound, be it this being testosterone, to be metabolized by the body and essentially gone, right? So used up. So when we look at ester length, what do we have? We have things like acetate, propionate, enanthate, cypionate. Now, all this refers to is the testosterone is the same across all four. Testosterone is still testosterone. However, the ester attached will depict on how quickly your body metabolizes. So an acetate may be in and out within 12 to 24 hours, propionate 1 to 3 days, enanthate 10 to 14 days, and the cypionate much longer. Now, in a HRT patient, they may be given, for example, testosterone and enanthate at a dose between 150 to 200 mg once fortnightly. That is okay because they are dosing within the physiological realm of what the human body can tolerate. So the thing that we're looking at here is when testosterone is used exogenously, it will hit a peak serum concentration level within the blood. What we are interested in is the conversion of that into DHT and E2 respectively, and the peak serum concentration levels of them too. Obviously, the smaller the dose, the smaller the peak concentration serum levels of testosterone. Coincidentally, the lower the peak concentration levels of DHT and E2 respectively. In the larger the dose, funnily enough, the larger the peak concentration of testosterone, the larger the peak serum concentration of E2 and DHT. Now, the problem being that with escalations into the supraphysiological realm, you are going to be running the risk of potentially running into some side effects. I say potentially because it depends very much on that genetic individuality that we see between people to exhibit said side effects from either of these two things. So having too high estrogen or too high DHT could potentially have some negative feedback. So one way to potentially mitigate this would be to dose more frequently with a smaller dose that would allow for a smaller conversion and a less high peak serum concentration level of testosterone, E2 and DHT. This would essentially keep your levels maintained at a more linear progression throughout the week. So let's say you was dosing it daily, you would have your peaks and troughs in a much shorter range, whereas if you was to dose twice weekly, you'd have a big peak and a drop off, and a big peak and a drop off. Or even more so, fortnightly, big peak, drop off to your next dose, big peak again. These big peaks are where you could potentially run into these negative feedback and negative side effects. Another ground to look at why opting for microdosing compared to macrodosing would be more favourable is when you look into scar tissue buildup. Now, the body is going to have a much easier time breaking down and moving a smaller depot or deposit of fluid than it is a larger one. So microdosing with smaller amounts compared to macrodosing with a large amount is more favourable to negate the build-up of scar tissue over time. Obviously, if you're rotating injection sites and injection points, then you should be mitigating that as well. But again, the smaller the dose, the better, the easier it is to break it down. And when it comes to stage time, if you're a competitor, you don't want to be skinned, peeled, and have like little lumps visible of scar tissue build up inside the muscle, because it does get looked down upon. So the only real negative I see within microdosing is the fact that you have to pin more frequently. But when you weigh up the actual feel of pinning, say 2 ml fluid compared to maybe 0.4 or 0.5 ml fluid, the actual feel of that with inside tissue or with inside the body, whether it's in the subcutaneous layer, whether it's intramuscularly, will be considerably different. So yes, you are pinning more, but the actual feel of that physically compared to having a much larger one. It's going to be much less painful and much less noticeable and give you much less discomfort. It's just the actual act of having to pin more frequently. That's the only real negative that there is within this. And if you was to opt, say your doses are within the range that would be feasible to do subcutaneously, then pinning daily doesn't really have that much hindrance. Subcutaneous injection is extremely easy and it's not very discomforting on the body or physique. It doesn't get in the way. You know, you might get, if you do an intramuscular quad injection, for example, or maybe a tricep injection, you might have a little bit of discomfort if you was to train it the next day, or, you know. So I think microdosing can be worked around 100%. I know it's not everyone's cup of tea, and it's probably the one thing within enhancement practice that we would all say we don't like, and that is the fact that we have to inject these substances. But when you weigh up the pros and cons to microdosing versus macrodosing, I think it's very, very clear, very, very obvious that microdosing is the much more favourable of the two. And that is it for me today, guys. A little look into microdosing versus macrodosing and why you may consider microdosing to be a more viable option with dosing frequency of your anabolic and androgenic steroids. So until the next time, guys, peace.